Hey everyone, I decided to make a YouTube video to present my research data. I thought that this would probably appeal to younger audiences who would rather hear something and see it as opposed to just reading it. So, um, my paper was on congressional term limits, and I wanted to start off by saying that I feel that America is the greatest example and the greatest force for democracy that's ever existed, and that's due to a lot of the very unique features that we have in our government and a lot of the checks and balances and safety measures that were put into place by the founding fathers, who amazingly thought all of this stuff up, from scratch. But anyways, um, there are some flaws in our government. It's obviously not perfect, but like I said, there are a lot of checks and balances and things like that to make up for the slack that's left whenever possible. And I feel that one of the shortcomings would have to be the fact that there are no term limits in place for members of Congress. Um, Congress is a very fundamental part of the government, and a lot of people don't know much about it. They don't really know that Congress is, in a lot of ways, the heart and soul of the government, and the president is sometimes just the face. And just a little background information on Congress that I put in the paper. First of all, when someone says Congress, they're usually referring to it's actually a group of two bodies: the House of Representatives and the House of Senators, and collectively they make what we call Congress. Um, there are 100 senators, two from each state. There are 435 representatives in the House, and that comes down to the population of the state. That decides how many representatives in the House that your state would get. Um, so, one of the main things that Congress does that I'll just stick to in the video and in the paper is they make laws. I mean, they literally have the power to write laws and enact them. And they also have the power to change the Constitution, to make amendments to it, which they've exercised the power in many positive ways throughout history. Um, so it's a pretty big deal. I mean, it's a pretty powerful thing, right? The president doesn't have the power to do a lot of the things that Congress is able to do. And in some ways, for example, with a law, if Congress introduces a law and ends up passing it, which it must be passed by 2/3 in the House and in the Senate separately, first the House and then the Senate. And if they pass a law, it goes to the president. He can sign it into law or veto it and deny it. And actually, Congress has the power to override his veto, which is, if you know anything about government, it's a pretty big deal. You override the president's veto, which we actually just saw recently with a law and President Obama. Um, so yeah, Congress. There are a lot of committees that are formed within Congress, groups of people who know things on certain areas and collaborate with the private sector experts on subject matter for certain areas and so forth. Um, but one thing about Congress is they have never had term limits. It was never written in the Constitution that there's a limit on how many terms they can serve. Now, in the beginning, there wasn't with the president either, and that's another section in my paper was George Washington voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms, and he set sort of an unofficial limit that all presidents after that followed until FDR, and in 1951, the 22nd Amendment was passed and written into the Constitution that limited the president to 2 terms. And we've seen a lot of term limits pop up all over in state government and different federal positions with, for the most part, success. I mean, it's been successful. I think it's a fundamental part of securing democracy and a very good safety check. So the idea of term limits for constitutions, they were thrown around during the formation of the government by the founding fathers. They did throw the term around a lot, and it didn't make it into the final plan of the final draft of the Constitution from the original Articles of Confederation and other papers that were in the Virginia Plan that were used as kind of the framework for the Constitution. It didn't make it to the final draft because, let's face it, they had a lot of things that were going on. I mean, like I said earlier, they were literally building what has become arguably the greatest force for democracy, or the greatest democracy ever to exist. They were busy writing all that from scratch. So it didn't make it to the final plan. It took a lower priority, and it didn't make it in there. But there were many of the founding fathers who supported the idea of congressional term limits. So in the 90s, there was a lot of frustration began with Congress, with the government in general. And there was a wave of citizen initiatives to impose term limits on state legislators now and congressmen. Now, the state legislators are people who work closely with Congress. They're people who they do sort of the same job as Congress, but on a state level. And like I said, they can work closely with Congress, and they can help write laws. They can help be part of these think tanks and etc. So in the 90s, there was a wave of citizen initiatives to put into place term limits on legislators and congressmen. Oklahoma became the first state, then Colorado, then California, and it started a trend. And by the year 2000, there were 15 states that had enacted term limits for legislators or representatives. However, in 2004, the Supreme Court ruled that any term limits regarding federal employees, i.e. congressmen, not state legislators, were unconstitutional, and the states did not have power to alter the requirements for being able to be elected as a state congressman. So that got shot down. Many of the state legislators' laws and limits did stay in place, but there's only one. There are only two ways that we can impose term limits on Congress. The first is the traditional way, by traditional means, which would be the House puts forth a bill that would be an amendment for the Constitution for term limits on Congress. They would have to put forth that bill themselves, agree on it, pass it through the House by 2/3. Senate would have to agree on it and pass it, and then the president would have to sign it into law. Obviously, these people, the congressmen, the politicians, are not going to sign in a law themselves that limits their own future in Congress, in politics, so to speak. This has been attempted multiple times, twice in the 1990s, and each time it was declined. Each time the House did not pass any pushes for amendments for term limits to Congress. Now, the other way is by means of what is called a um, a constitutional convention. Now, in the Constitution, the founding fathers, in their wisdom, left something called Article 5. Article 5 allows the states to convene and sort of bypass Congress on some issues, and they can actually, if 2/3 of the states pass said amendment or whatever they're convening about, they can actually do that by bypassing Congress. They don't need Congress's approval. So there's only been, I believe, one constitutional convention, very long time ago, shortly after the founding of the country. But that would be the only other way that the states would be able to enact a constitutional amendment to impose term limits on Congress. So yeah, I mean, the only people who don't want term limits are pretty much Congress and lobbyists, special interest groups. Now, special interest groups and lobbyists, they spoil Congress. They pretty much buy them out after years of influence. They say, hey, I'll support your campaign if you'll do this and this for me when you get elected. Things of that nature. And one of the biggest perks to term limits on Congress is that it should eliminate most of this. Being that there's a maximum number of years that a representative is going to be in Congress, there's usually not going to be enough time for them to get conned in by lobbyists and special interest groups. That usually is something that happens over the period of a decade or longer, in which, in those regards, there are plenty of congressmen who have been in office for decades, multiple decades. And supporters of term limits argue that this would nearly eliminate the influence of these groups if we impose term limits. Now, one of the toughest things that comes along with incumbency is it's really hard for a challenger to dethrone someone who's been in Congress for a while, someone who has a bigger campaign. They have more money to spend on a campaign. They have more contributors. They have, again, lobbyists and special interest groups to contribute to their campaign and help them out. And I did plenty of research with like the NCLS and the FEC, and it's pretty much, it's plain as day that the more money you spend on a campaign, the more likely you are to win. And there's just, all of the evidence would point to pretty much a direct link. So incumbency has one of the greatest advantages when it comes to re-election, and that's the big problem. That's the rebuttal to many people who oppose term limits. Say that, well, then, if we want term limits, if we don't want these people serving for decades, then why do we keep re-electing them over and over? And my reply to that would be the fact that they have a tremendous advantage being an incumbent already against a challenger of pretty much any kind or caliber. And that's just the way it is. I mean, you can go and look at the numbers. You can go to the FEC's website. You can look at the numbers, and it'll tell you. For example, in the 90s, Congress came up with this brilliant idea that, okay, we will we'll limit how much. Let's say we could limit how much campaigners are allowed to spend. So their bright idea was, let's say, it was more of a thought experiment. If we set the cutoff limit at 600,000, there, everybody's happy. Well, the problem is they would always say they wanted to set the limit right at the amount where a challenger spending that amount or more becomes or obtains at least a 50% chance of winning in that election. So in a way, you're creating more advantage for the incumbent. You're not only going with all of the other advantages that an incumbent has, that would effectively cut the only means for a challenger to truly have a greater than 50%, even 50% chance. So a lot of these ideas are self-serving. They're self-serving principles and ideas that come from Congress itself. I mean, you can't blame them. But term limits have been extremely successful for so many areas of government across the board: local, state, federal, so many, worldwide. It's just something that it's a fundamental part of democracy, I believe. Regardless of how good a candidate is or how good they did serving their 2 prior elections. Just take the presidency for example. No matter how great of a president we have from here on out, no matter how great he is for 2 terms, we're not allowed to elect him for a 3rd, and we're okay with that. We accept that. So I don't understand how the same rule doesn't apply to Congress. For opposers of term limits for Congress, that's a big part of their argument is, what if we have a really great congressman, then we can't reelect him? Well, that's part of a democracy. I mean, that's part of my basic argument here is I'm looking at the fundamentals, and that's part of the game. Parting is sweet sorrow with a great politician. That's just welcome to the big leagues. That's kind of how I feel about that one. So basically, Congress has gotten to the point now where it doesn't represent us. It represents the lobbyists, special interest groups, the people who are lining their pockets. They spend millions of dollars collectively on campaigning, and this is why they continue to be reelected. People are uneducated on the issue. People don't understand how important Congress is. People don't follow congressional elections the way that they do superficially every 4 years for the presidential elections. And I just think of these congressmen who have been in office for decades now, 40 years and plus. Think of all of the hours that their staff and they themselves have spent campaigning. It's not even hours, it's days. And if we're talking about people who have served for decades, we're not talking about a total time of days. We're talking about they've probably spent all in all years or a year or so of their time in office just campaigning. All of the phone calls and just any type of work related to campaigning that these helpers and people who work for the congressmen have to do, all of this time could be spent on real issues, helping real people, and doing real work in government. And that's my argument. I hope this video would be easier for, again, someone who's a little bit younger or just somebody who would prefer to hear me tell you about this paper that I wrote as opposed to reading it. So I hope you enjoyed. I enjoyed the term with everyone, and thank you for watching.